The challenges of distributing aid to Gaza and throughout the Strip have not gotten easier. To the contrary, it's only gotten more complex as the destruction of the Strip has worsened. There are really three challenges here that all touch on the security piece, which is logistical, the situation of desperation, which is really also impeding on that distribution, and then ultimately political. When the U.S. announced that they were going to set up this pier, it was very clear to everyone involved that this was going to be a very expensive and politically meaningful gesture, but that realistically it wasn't going to solve some of the key logistical issues, which is finding safe, secure, and functioning roads to transfer that aid across the Gaza Strip and to bring it to the communities that need it most. So that's the first key challenge that they're dealing with. The second is one of desperation. When Gazans see these trucks, they often are fearful that it is the only time they're going to have access to that sort of aid. And so they are charging those trucks and grabbing things and engaging in what some are calling self-distribution, because, again, they are desperate. And then the third piece is really political will here. We're seeing challenges on the Israeli side as well, where Israeli extremists are looking to stop the flow of aid into Israel. But there is an incentive on the part of the Israeli government to move that aid forward as it works to coordinate support for its Rafah incursion with the United States. So all that is to say the challenges are formidable and will continue to be. And we might not see that port operational until this war is nearly at an end.
Well, that's saying something. We just heard from Jake Sullivan, Carmiel, at the White House, national security advisor to the president, who says aid from the pier has reached some Palestinian civilians. But the fact is it takes at least a day to process the aid at the pier. There's very limited distribution in some areas of Gaza, certainly in Rafah. Was this a flawed concept to begin with?
Look, this is an impossible situation. Given, as I said, the security situation in Gaza, the inability to ensure that anyone who is delivering that aid is going to be safe, destruction on roads, all of these other pieces. In many ways, this was mission impossible, but also mission necessary. Just because it's difficult to get aid to the people in Gaza does not mean that anyone can step away from this imperative. People in Gaza are on the brink of a famine, and their situation isn't getting any better. So it behooves the international community to look for any possible avenue to increase that aid and distribution. But these types of complications and hiccups are going to be inevitable, given that there's also no real centralized civil distribution network within Gaza. And this blows open the continual problem in that Israel has no strategy for the day after and what comes next. And so we're seeing that play out in the immediate term, and we're going to continue to see it play out in the future.
Well, let's keep thinking about what comes next, because in light of what we have seen so far in the last 24 hours, Ireland, Norway, and Spain announcing that they would recognize a Palestinian state, and the subsequent Israeli recalling its ambassadors to those countries, not reacting well to this. I wonder, Carmiel, if a number of sovereign countries saying that they would recognize a Palestinian state actually makes it less likely that that Palestinian state can be realized in the near term, because it only causes those currently in power to Israel to kind of retrench and circle the wagons and voice opposition to the idea of a two-state solution.
That's exactly right. The declaration of Palestinian statehood by countries, which, mind you, more than 100 countries, I think about 140, have already done that. But doing that in this moment and generally is deeply alienating for the Israelis, who feel that the Palestinians can't just be given this statehood recognition. Statehood must come through a negotiated, durable, two-state solution, an agreement that both parties have come to. And the problem is that statehood is really just words. There aren't very serious practical implications for this. And so it doesn't move the parties closer together. It just divides them further.
Where is the administration now on operations in Rafah? Because our reporting says that the administration is softening its stand on this. I believe it was a red line for President Biden, said that on the record a couple of weeks ago. Is that red line moving?
So I think the question is whether the red line is moving or the Israelis are moving. And the answer is somewhere in between the two. The Israelis have taken very seriously what the United States has been saying. And there's been sort of a difference between what they're saying publicly and what they're saying behind closed doors. So publicly, Biden had put forward what was increasingly sounding like a generic red line. Any type of incursion into Rafah was unacceptable. But privately, that's not really what these conversations have looked like. What they've really been saying is that any incursion into Rafah has to look a certain way. There has to be serious and meaningful efforts to evacuate civilians. There has to be a pathway. The type of operation that's carried out matters a lot. And what we're seeing and hearing is what the Israelis are intending to do and have already begun doing is relatively narrow, in that what they're really focusing on is tunnels and transit routes in Rafah rather than kind of a larger scale piece. And that will allow them to contain civilian casualties, and in many ways already has. So we're finding a convergence in terms of what the Israeli and American position had been around Rafah.
Carmiel, of course, while the U.S. administration's position has long been that they wouldn't like to see a major ground operation in Rafah that could cause massive civilian casualties, they also have been loudly, repeatedly calling for a temporary ceasefire deal and sending diplomats to the Middle East to try and further that effort. It feels like, though, now for all of the hope that maybe existed weeks ago, it's long gone. Is there any real prospect of a temporary ceasefire deal now?
I think the parties are going to continue to negotiate. The Israelis had hoped that the threat of a Rafah operation and what it could look like would strengthen their hands at the negotiating table, and felt that the U.S. had taken that away from them, essentially by hamstringing the extent of what Rafah could be. Because of that, the Egyptians had really withdrawn their role from this. Egypt had been, of course, also trying to prevent a Rafah operation. But what you see is the Qataris continuing to move ahead. We're also hearing conversations shift, where we're not just looking now at a temporary ceasefire. As this war starts to, again, kind of wind down, remember that there are only 4 brigades of Hamas that are still, battalions that are still operating in Rafah, and that's what Israel's been really interested in. But starting to think now more and more about what a long-term outcome would look like. And so you have Qatar still at the talk of temporary ceasefire talks, but also partnering up with the Saudis as the U.S. and the Saudis negotiate on a potential long-term negotiation for normalization. And that could also include an end to the conflict.